Thank you.
So I'm going to be talking about translating or adapting empowerment to international context, but starting with notes about domestic issues. And I want to acknowledge the great team that I've had in all of this work. Greg Rebchuk, who's not here today, he's worked on the adaptation of the overall adaptation wherever we go. Andres Mayorana has worked on the Lima part. Scott Tebbets has worked on the Beirut part. And then I want to acknowledge my other team members. Next slide. So the aim of my talk is to discuss the process through which empowerment has been adapted for international sites. I'm not going to be talking about implementation or the final version of the manual or intervention protocol post-implementation. I'm talking more about as we are getting ready to do the research, what we were doing in each place, what were we doing to adapt it. And so I'm not also going to be talking much about the specific adaptations we made for Peru or Lebanon. Next slide. So the previous research is that we developed empowerment to target HIV prevention and testing among young gay, bi, same gender loving MSM ages 18 to 29. It's a multi-level intervention working at individual, social, community, and structural levels. The original research we did was conducted in small college towns with mostly white MSM, and we thought that we were developing something that would work for all young MSM. And pretty soon off, we realized that no, we were pretty much adapting it for young white MSM, middle class, and we were missing the boat. So it's missing the boat about adapting it for young men of color. And so adaptation issues had to be addressed very soon after our original research because of the diversity among ethnic racial groups of young MSM living in diverse contexts in the US, and because community-based organizations right off wanted to start implementing it, but they also wanted to start adapting it right away. So we needed to start thinking about how we could work with them, how we could provide technical assistance and training and so forth to help them to make wise choices in adaptation. Next. I also have come at this from a cultural humility stance. I always try to consider carefully my intersecting identities and how these have shaped my lived experiences and worldviews, and how the intersecting identities and lived experience of young MSM vary considerably from my own. So unlike Ruben, who may have known a lot of these issues from the inside, I recognize that I don't. I've never been a young gay man. So I recognize the need to always collaborate with others who know the population. Next. So baked into the fabric of empowerment is community collaboration and community engagement. And this is done through one of the core elements, the core group. So empowerment is run by and for young MSM via the core group. And we developed a comprehensive manual incorporating considerable input from community-based organizations and health department staff. So we always have seen collaboration, community collaboration and engagement as critical. Next. Our early research then, we were also one of the interventions that the CDC supported throughout most of the epidemic. And so we started doing research on core elements and so forth early on. And so we identified the guiding principles that underlie the intervention. And the awareness of these enable operational variations. So a constant conceptualization of the separation of the desired processes we're trying to get going that lead to the changes and outcomes from how they're operationalized. They don't always have to be operationalized the exact same way. And the guiding principles are incorporated into every core element of the intervention and used to guide adaptations. So exactly how the core elements are implemented differs from location to location, as long as they address the processes and the guiding principles. Next slide. So here are the guiding principles. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll talk about a few. So empowerment, the project, as I said, is run by and for young MSM. They think out many of the parts of the intervention, not the basic core structure, but how it's all implemented, they think out. And they take on the messages about HIV prevention themselves. It's also based on peer influence, that peers are most likely to influence other peers. And so we mobilize peers to support and talk with their friends. And then the project has always been sex positive. We've never used shame. We never talk about don't do that. It's always been a very positive approach, recognizing that sex is wonderful, it's fun, it can be loving. And we always talk about sex in a positive way and focusing on pride in who you are. Next slide. These are the core elements. There are a number of core elements. It is a big and pretty complicated intervention, but they all relate to each other. So there's the core group, as I've said, it takes place in a project space. As well as going out in the community. There's formal outreach that goes out into the community and spreads the messages. And we have outreach events, social events that bring people to the project. Informal outreach involves young men talking with their peers and supporting their peers around HIV prevention. There's an ongoing publicity about the project. And there's M groups, which is the most formulaic approach that we have, where we do lay out how to do this. And these are one-time 3-hour groups, the way we've done them in the US, that touch upon many specific issues about HIV prevention, as well as how to do informal outreach. Next. So we also developed key characteristic of each core element. And these concretely describe how the guiding principles are incorporated into core elements. So for example, here are some of the key characteristics of the core group. The core group is empowered to make decisions. They're encouraged to analyze problems in their community and how activities that they will implement will address those problems. It needs to be large enough group to do the work. They're comprised of men representing different segments of the young men's community. And the core group has to be fun and social at least some of the time in order to keep core group members attending. They don't usually come to something just because it's about HIV prevention. They come because they want to meet other young gay men and have fun. Next slide. So we start with, when we're thinking about how to adapt it, that we review or conduct ethnographic research on young MSM. And there's a host of questions that we ask. And if it's already been published before, done before, that's great. Otherwise, we do it ourselves. And we always include experts who know about these issues. So as just some of the examples, where does the HIV risk come from? Boyfriend, casual partners, what are their ages? What are attitudes towards HIV testing? How much HIV testing is done among young men? We definitely talk about the nature of stigma. It's ever present. And how is it manifested? How does it affect young men? So we'll talk about HIV stigma. We'll learn about how stigma is aimed at young MSM, gay bi men, and racial ethnic group membership. And we also try to learn about the internalization of these kinds of stigma, how they experience it outwards, and how the interaction between what you experience outwards and what you internalize. Next. And then these are examples of more questions that we need to know about. Where do men socialize together? Where and how? Are there bars, clubs, public sex environments? How out are young men in this community, in this culture? What are different segments of men in the community? Is there a cohesive community? How do young MSM trust? Do they trust each other? Do they not trust anyone? How do they communicate with each other? And the degree of comfort discussing sex. So these are all issues we try to learn about as we're getting ready to start doing adaptation. Next. So going to Peru, the foci of the adaptation there was working with Peruvian working class and lower income MSM. And I forgot to say, it's also about 18 to 35, I believe. We also were working with, or we're just ending the project now, with transgender women together with gay men. And both between the two of them, they had to have the majority of HIV in Peru. And we also included in this adaptation concepts from Rafael Diaz's work, qualitative research and intervention for immigrant Latino MSM to the US, such as machismo, familismo, and so forth. And then we've heavily relied on our collaboration with our Peruvian colleagues. Our US team has worked with our Peruvian colleagues on, we began with a multi-site international study in which MSM were one group. And then we went on to conduct a small qualitative study of transgender women in 3 cities from a CAPS Innovative grant. And then we obtained and conducted an R34 grant. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. And then it followed by an R01. So we took this, it was a fairly long, lengthy process of moving into full intervention. So analysis of the guiding principles and core elements takes a substantial amount of time. An earlier presenter, perhaps Laura, I'm not sure, was talking about how it takes time. You need a slow and thorough analysis. You really need time to reflect. You can't do this in a rushed method. It took many days and many weeks and many months over time. And all of our work to initially start thinking about the adaptations was done in person with our whole team together. And we always had a very diverse team with a long history of working together. So it was a combined US Argentinian, Peruvians, and US Peruvian people on the project. We had gay men, a straight man, and straight women on the team. We had a community social psychologist, that's me, ethnographers, epidemiologists, and 2 physician social researchers. So quite a combination team of experts from different points of view and different expertise. Next. So we ask of this as we're going through the analysis of guiding principles, and we essentially tear each principle apart, discuss it thoroughly, and then rebuild it in the adapted form. So we start with, what do we mean by this construct, this guiding principle? Is it relevant here? Does it make sense? Are there barriers and facilitators to this? Are there caveats to following this guiding principle in Peru? What does the ethnographic research say about this? And does this vary? Do these findings vary between MSM and transgender women? And how can each guiding principle be applied to helping MSM and transgender women work together? Next. To go on, then we also went through the core elements one by one, having reviewed all the guiding principles. I won't go through each of these, but we ask things like, what are the goals of this core element? What are the variations we've seen before? Because by the time we were doing this research in Peru, my team and I had already worked with something like 200 organizations in the US that were trying to do adaptations, and many were Latino adaptations. So what are the concerns that they might have about the core elements? Does it make any sense, the core elements? We really wanted to go back to the start. Does this core element even make sense here? Have you done it before? Has anyone done it before? And how did it work? Really exploring the guiding principles incorporated into the core element. Do they make sense? Should each core element be conducted together or separately for MSM and trans women? And then for some areas, especially as we are adapting Rafael's ideas, we had to consider how to develop new exercises, and even the old exercises, such as role plays, for example, or musical chairs. We always use a lot of gamification approaches. I didn't know that was a term until recently, but we've been doing it forever. We always make the activities fun and engaging and interactive. And these sometimes had to be completely revamped from the US to Peru. Next. We then, after we had developed our core elements and the guiding principles, then we conducted focus groups, we especially focused on the M group exercises. And we would do a focus group with 1 to 3 exercises with real MSM and trans women, not our team. And we would try it out, and then we would stop and say, well, what did you think? How did you experience that? What do you think we were trying to address? And then after we had gone through that with all of the exercises, we put them all together and piloted it in total. And with MSM for one M group and for trans women in a separate group. And we realized that they needed to become 4 sessions instead of 1 long session in the US, as we do in the US. And then with our R34, we piloted the entire intervention for 9 months in Callao, an area near Lima. And then after that, we were able to revise it. But in the interim, sort of the HIV world had changed quite a bit, and we realized that we now wanted to not only address prevention and testing, but we wanted to move into addressing the entire continuum of prevention and care. So it was a major revamping from that, but thankfully we weren't required to go back to another R34. Next. So these are just a smattering of findings and adaptation. So the core group involved both MSM and trans women, and they talked extensively about stigma from other people, internalized stigma, and how to work together, realizing that they had a lot more in common than they had realized before, and they could really work together. We learned that masculinity is very privileged, whether it's masculine MSM or men who have sex with transgender women, and that the more femme men tended not to be proud of themselves very much. And it's important to recognize that these are not related to being tops or bottoms. And we realized that we needed to consider masculinity issues in all of the core elements. We learned that government provided condoms were seen as defective and that lube is very expensive. So we had to consider that. We found that life is pretty boring in these communities. They pretty much just watch TV and there's not much else going on, and they're looking for things to do. So social activities, including the core group involvement, is a draw. And they're willing to come to multiple sessions of M groups. But we also needed to accommodate many trans women who are sex workers, and we had to take into account their work schedules. They work in the evenings. We found that talking about sex with friends is challenging and counter-normative, and this goes into sexual silence that Raphael talked about. So they need lots of practice to be able to talk about sex with each other. And trans women were not interested in tending because of attraction to each other. They weren't coming to look for other trans women to be partners with, but they were attracted to the project because they have common interests such as cooking, human rights, how to deal with police. So we still found ways to attract them to the project. Next slide. Okay, so now let's go to an entirely different continent. And this is in Beirut, Lebanon. This project was conducted with a diverse team as well, we only had a short time of working together, the time of an R01. And it was a combined US Lebanese team. It also had gay men, lesbian women, a straight woman on the team. And in terms of background, community social psychologist, a clinical psychologist, a sociologist, qualitative research, a master's level qualitative researcher, 2 human rights, health, or social activists, one who was gay and one who was lesbian. There was no team building done on the project. I wasn't PI. And the trust and rapport was not really established very well for genuine conversations about adaptation issues and brainstorming together. It was a 5-year R01, and it was posited as a large pilot study. And we were able to do a limited amount of qualitative research at the very start of the project. Next slide. So let's think about the context of Beirut and Lebanon. So there was a prior civil war that had ended in 1990, but it still had an impact in which it was a multifaceted armed conflict that took place for 15 years, and it resulted in many deaths and an exodus of 1 million people. Beirut is the most liberal city in the Middle East, especially before the Civil War, but still currently. There had been no MSM intervention conducted before that we knew of. And there were lots of refugees in Lebanon from Palestine from years earlier and from Syria currently during the project, which increased the country's population by 50%, huge. And there were many illegal refugees. People could simply walk over the mountains and come over to Lebanon from Syria. There are only a few gay rights organizations, and we partnered with one of them. There's tremendous police harassment ever present, and especially, but not solely, about illegal Syrians. So if they're stopped, and there's lots of traffic stops all the time, and if they are carrying a condom, carrying anything suggesting gay, anything on their cell phones, they're required to open their cell phones and show police what's on their cell phones, and they are then at risk of being thrown out of the country or worse. Next. So what did we focus on for the adaptation? Well, we were focusing on young MSM, again, 18 to 29, who live in the Beirut area. They're very diverse in terms of religion. They're raised Christian or Muslim. Most of the guys were no longer considered themselves Christian or Muslim, and we always heard about how the gay community didn't care about that. I still think that was questionable if they didn't care about that. There were diversity in terms of nationality because there were refugees from all sorts of other countries, such as Iraq. Diversity in terms of their legal status, their economic status. Many of the refugees were very, very poor. And whether they wanted to stay in Lebanon or were leaving Lebanon. We constantly heard people saying that they were trying to get out of Lebanon. And there's diversity in terms of fear of the police. I mean, everyone's afraid of them, but the middle-class Lebanese men were not so fearful, but the refugees were very fearful, and nearly all were very worried about confidentiality. And there was enormous pressure on appearance. It sometimes reminded me more of Los Angeles than of a Middle Eastern country, about how you looked, clothing, hair, beards, what kind of car you drove, and so forth. Next slide.
Sorry to interrupt, Susan, just to let you know that we are getting about to time here, a little bit over, as a matter of fact. So yeah, we just want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So thank you so much. This is all.
I'm almost done. So we reviewed the manual. We had weekly 2-hour meetings for several months to review it. There was some degree of disagreement and distrust among the team. One person, for example, talking about pride and said, what's to be proud of just because you're gay? You're just born that way. Where's the pride about? And then we revised the manual afterwards. Next. We did a 3-day retreat where we worked with community members, reviewed everything, talked about everything. We revised it. We then piloted it with gay men, and then we revised the intervention protocol again. Go ahead. We implemented most of the core elements, but they lacked many of the key characteristics. And although I had been optimistic that we could find ways around it, such as how to do publicity, we had a very difficult time doing it. And things like the space was poorly utilized. The core group did not represent diverse segments of the community and so forth. So it was really difficult to implement the core elements as we had desired. Next. So Lebanon and the project, the processes we were trying to engage just didn't happen very well. 6 months after the end of the project, there was a huge explosion, many of you might have heard of, in which many people in Beirut died, and Lebanon has been falling apart. Nearly everyone we worked with there has left the country, as well as many of the young MSM have left. And we have not gone on to do more research in the Middle East and North Africa about MSM. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That is a informative talk, and thanks to all of our panelists for what was a very informative panel. We will be taking questions in the chat or by raising hand, just like we did the last time. Sherry will be monitoring that. But I just want to start this. Each of you in your own ways sort of touched on this. It came up in sort of different ways. And that is basically this tension between thoroughness and speed in some cases, or just inability to be thorough in some way. It can be that you're pressed for time, like happened with digital interventions around the rollout of COVID, where suddenly you had to make everything online. It can be the kind of research program gets thrown askew by world events in the case of Ruben's talks, or what Ruben's research, and Susan, what you were just talking about there. And so how do you balance that? Like, is there an intervention light that makes sense in a certain situation, or is there just a situation where you have to say adaptation is just not going to work in this context?
I have lots of mixed thoughts about it, so I'm trying to narrow it down to one thing. I think going in a light way, we've considered quite a bit in lots of different settings, but the problem is you still need to have these activities, the mechanisms going on. And so we haven't been able to figure out how to do that in a lighter way, at least in international context, or for that matter, in the US. I mean, that was one of the problems we had in Peru, for example. Publicity was really important so that you reach different communities, since it's a community-wide approach. And we couldn't do it. I guess you could say we tried it in a lighter way because we weren't able to do it other than very limited stuff. And the news just didn't get out about this intervention throughout the community. So it's difficult. You really have to think about, are you being able to achieve the processes you're trying to achieve if you go in a light form?
So there's a similar or a related question in the chat from Jenny Kang, who asks, do the panelists have insights on experiencing in balancing scale-up projects for greater reach across populations versus the rigorous adaptation? And I would say that the scale up might be potentially a lighter approach, so similar to what you've been talking about, but insights on balancing this sort of scale up for more folks versus rigorous adaptation.
One reason that we had to get into rigorous evaluations with some of our work domestically is because community-based organizations would say, well, you showed that it worked with so-and-so, but you haven't showed that it worked with my population, so I don't trust it. And so we had to go towards a little bit more rigorous approaches to be able to get it so that it was trustworthy in the country. But then we also worked with, the organizations that moved towards implementing it in the US. And in that way, we were able to see a lot of ways that they might it was being scaled up, but they weren't involving rigorous evaluations. It was more focusing on, are you doing the key characteristics? Are you achieving that? And in ways of thinking about fidelity.